Hello, Ames Chamber of Commerce members. This is Drew Camp, Vice President at the Ames Chamber of Commerce, here for our first actual in-session weekly legislative update for the 2020 legislative session. As you can imagine, the first week of session is quite a bit of, frankly, pomp and circumstance. You have all of the conditions of the state from the governor, a condition of the judiciary from the now interim Chief Justice of the Iowa Supreme Court, and then just today we'll actually have the condition of the Guard from Major General Orr here for the Iowa National Guard. So those are really some of the big things that happened today. There are some committee meetings and things like that, but nothing's of substance really happens this week. It's really next week and the weeks after where they start to really kind of dig into some policy bills, especially some of those pre-filed bills and some of those pieces of legislation that were carried over from last session that they can really kind of work on. But what I really want to do this week is I want to just hit on 4 core issues that were really highlighted in the governor's condition of the state that we were really happy about. And those issues are tax reform, child care, Future Ready Iowa, which is a major workforce issue, working with our educators, and then also infrastructure. All of those things were really hit on in a lot of very good ways that I want to highlight by the governor in her condition of the state of address. I do want to say before we jump into things, though, some important things to consider. If you listen to Senator Bain's recording for that biggest issue going into session, you'll remember that he talked about how they have to use the December revenue estimating conference numbers for the governor's budget, and then they have another revenue estimating conference in March that tells them where current state revenues are, and they have to use the lesser of the two. And the reason I mention that is because obviously the governor used in her budget that's about, I believe, 8.2 or right around $8 billion. She used the December revenue estimating conference numbers. They'll again get the March numbers. They'll have to use the lower of those two numbers to come up with the final budget that they'll pass here in April. Now, digging into some of those key issues, with tax reform, we were really excited to see the governor come on strong with what she's calling Invest in Iowa. And what that is it's an increase of the state sales tax by 1 cent under a broad strategy that would then increase sales tax revenue by $540 million. Yes, you heard that right, $540 million, very significant as you can imagine. Some of the key pieces of what that would fund is, number one, it would fully kick in the IWIL or the Iowa Water and Land Legacy for that 3/8 cent to go to the Outdoor Resource and Natural Recreation Trust Fund. But it would also, this was something we really were huge proponents for and we were really happy to see, it creates additional tax relief. And what that does is it helps our income tax competitive position and allows us to keep us as both individuals but also corporations to keep more of what they earn and reinvest it into things that go back into the well-being and quality of life of the state. Some big things that I really want to touch on are she's proposing, the governor that is proposing cutting the individual income tax by 10% on average in FY 2021. And then also lowering the highest rate from 8.5% to 5.5% by 2023, reducing the number of tax brackets from 9 to 8 in 2021, and further reducing them to 4 by FY 2023. And why that's so important is it really just provides certainty for companies if that is something that's able to be written into law, and it also just really kind of makes our tax system more, it tightens it up and it makes it more easy to understand, and it really just streamlines it is a really good word for it. And that's something we've been advocating for 10 years. So seeing these kinds of proposals really gets us excited about the potential that they could have. Some other important pieces that would be funded by that $540 million with that 1 cent sales tax increase would be the increase of early childhood development and childhood dependent care tax credits. It would double the maximum for net income that requires your eligibility and determines your eligibility from $45,000 to $90,000. That's a really big issue, and we'll touch on childcare more here in a little bit. But childcare is something that's really limiting our employers and people getting into the workforce, so we want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to address that. I already mentioned it'll fully fund the Natural Resource and Outdoor Recreation Trust Fund. What that really does is it largely will impact water quality with about $100 million, then about another $50 million will go to some recreation and natural resource funds for like recreational enhancement and protection, trails, water projects, things along those lines. So that would be something that would be very good for quality of life and placemaking. It would also utilize the increased sales tax to replace 70% of the property tax levy for Iowa's regional mental health system, ensuring that every Iowan has the ability to grow and be healthy and productive. That's really, really important because you did hear that right. It would then take, the state would have 70% of the responsibility for the mental health property tax levy. And that's so important because we all know that mental health is a major issue throughout the state. So getting that addressed and kind of taking some of that responsibility off of the county coffers, what that can really do is it positively impacts local property taxes because that doesn't put as much of a burden on the county. It's more at the state level with those sales tax and diversifying of the tax base. So that has some really, really good opportunities that we're excited about and we look forward to advocating for. The next major issue that I touched on was childcare. And that's something we've talked about for a long, long time. It's a major workforce issue. And the biggest thing that we really want to make sure we're doing is we want to make sure that we're increasing the availability and the quality. And some of the ways that the governor proposed to do that are increasing the number of families that qualify for the early childhood development and child independent care tax credits by, once again, doubling that minimum income requirement from $45,000 to $90,000. That's a big deal. That'll make that available for a lot more people. It also expands the eligibility for child care assistance by implementing a tiered copay system for families earning 185% or up to 225% of the federal poverty level. As a family income increases, so does their child care cost in the state. So this puts families on a path to self-sufficiency and alleviates the child care cliff effect. The cliff effect is a really, really big issue, and making sure that with her explicitly stating that she wants to address that, we know several people in legislative leadership also want to address that cliff effect. So that's a really, really big and important thing to point out and make sure that we're emphasizing as well. It would also change, she is also proposing changing the definition for infant and toddler to include children aged 2 weeks to 3 years, and for preschool to include children 3 years to school age. By changing the definition, child care providers will receive a higher reimbursement rate. That, once again, is very, very important because by receiving that rate, not only can they broaden their base, they can hopefully bring some of the costs down. It would also create a child care challenge fund within the Employer Innovation Fund, a matching grant program to help with the construction, renovation, and remodeling of child care facilities. This also is really, really important because as we look at Future Ready Iowa, you have the Employer Innovation Fund and you have the Last Dollar Scholarship. Both have been very, very impactful, but the fact that they're proposing allowing a child care challenge fund with grant funds to be used as part of that Employer Innovation Fund, that's very, very important because a lot of times employers look at the possibility of bringing on-site daycare, but it's just not economically viable. They can't make the numbers work. Well, if they look at this and maybe they can bridge that gap with some of these funds, that's something that makes that a little bit more feasible, and we would hope to see more of throughout the state to address that key issue. The next big issue I just kind of referenced, but this is something we're really, really excited to see the continued emphasis and funding of in the governor's condition of the state and her budget, is the continued support for Future Ready Iowa. This is a major workforce development initiative throughout the state. It brings all the key stakeholders together, and what she's proposing to do is having the Last Dollar Scholarship increase and expand, and that really is the connection of educators with community colleges, school districts, and students to make sure that anyone that needs that training, if there's a gap at the end, that's being bridged by these scholarships. What they're proposing is an increase in funding to $15.8 million to award scholarships for additional students, and also expand eligibility by allowing more flexibility in enrollment requirements, therefore getting more people in and more people trained, especially in the in those targeted industries and high need areas. With the Employer Innovation Fund, they also want to increase and expand the offerings by increasing funding to $4 million to support more community-level education and workforce development initiatives, and once again, expand to include the Child Care Challenge Fund to help with the construction, renovation, and remodeling of child care facilities. And as a reminder, that piece within the for child care for the Employer Innovation Fund, that's directly for employers on that side of things. And the last topic we really want to make sure we hit on is the infrastructure topic. We always talk about infrastructure because it's so important to have good infrastructure to build the companies and the job growth and the capital investment we want to see here in our communities. So some of the big things that the governor proposed that we are excited to see is an additional $20 million for flood relief following the flooding from last spring and summer. Obviously, that is a very, very big issue. We need to make sure those funds are there when and if, God forbid, those natural disasters happen. We are there to support the individuals with the money and the resources needed to help them recover from those and be better than they were before after the natural disaster. Also, the proposing of a $15 million for existing broadband grant program, which is a $10 million increase from the previous year, is hugely important. As we look at broadband expansion, there's a lot of great things happening in the state, and it's also important to note with these funds, if it does get increased to $15 million, you can then leverage federal funds as well to really make sure that you're maximizing the return on investment for some major projects. If you can recall, and if you pay attention to local politics, the city of Ames is really looking at some broadband expansion. So things along these lines would be very helpful as we look to possibly expand that resource of broadband and the availability to our constituents here in Ames and Story County. Another important thing to make sure we're monitoring as well is just always watching that road and bridge funding and transportation funding in general. Those are things obviously with Iowa Department of Transportation here and just the vast amount of bridges and roads and interstates and highways we have that the Iowa Department of Transportation oversees within Story County. That's something we're always going to make sure they're monitoring to make sure they're receiving the assistance they need and that certainty that they need to run that program, that being the Iowa Department of Transportation, in the manner that they need to each and every fiscal year. So with that, those are some of the big issues I really wanted to make sure we touched on and that we're really excited about as we head into the second week of the legislative session. Please do come back and join us next week for our next legislative update. Really looking forward to continuing to build momentum on these key issues. Thanks for watching.